There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great.
Okay, so my guest today on the Science Salon is Charles Cockell. He's the, let me read the proper biography here from your book. I always like the acknowledgments and the real biographies that are inside, not just on the dust jacket, because you learn a lot more about somebody. So Charles is the professor of astrobiology at the University of Edinburgh and the director of the UK Centre for Astrobiology. Received his BS in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Bristol and his doctorate in molecular biophysics from the University of Oxford. His interests encompass life in extreme environments, the habitability of extraterrestrial environments, and the exploration and settlement of space. He held a National Academy of Sciences association with NASA and worked at the British Antarctic Survey and Open University. Published over 300 scientific papers, numerous books, including a series on the condition for liberty beyond Earth. Hey, I got to tell you something funny. I had a little Twitter exchange with Elon Musk because I was.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he posted something about, he's like, I don't think he said he's an anarcho-capitalist, but something that was sort of offbeat like that. So I said, well, how are you going to govern your colony on Mars? And he said, what he said, and I thought, oh boy. And so I just started Googling around to see who's written about, how you would govern a colony out on another planet. And there you are. You've written a couple books on this.
Yeah, I've been interested in this for a while, but I went through a phase a few years ago of actually organizing some conferences where we put out 3 books on, liberty beyond Earth. Can you be free in an environment where people control the oxygen that you breathe? I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come back to that because I think it's a super interesting question because it is a grand experiment that I never thought would happen in my lifetime, but now it looks like it might.
Looks like it's happening pretty quickly,
And it brings to mind the seasteading movement, like you just plant some barges offshore far enough and then you start a new country or whatever. Well, wait a minute, who decides who gets the fresh water and what happens if pirates come and what if the guy next to me steals my stuff? And, I mean, there's always these implications for this. But let's first talk about your book. The new book is The Equations of Life, How Physics Shapes Evolution. By the way, this is a really beautiful cover.
Yeah, they did a fantastic job on it. It's really,
it's
really
like, how do you capture the concept of equations on a book cover without just sticking
in physics?
Putting equations on there, which is too cliche. But that's the Ladybug, right?
Yes, it is. That's the Ladybug in the sort of, the iconic physics, gravity, space-time depiction.
Right.
So I think that was a really nice way, as you say, to link biology with physics. And in some sense, when you look at it, the obvious way to do it, actually, but I wouldn't have thought of it if I had been asked to come up with a cover.
That's why you and I write the interiors and somebody else designs the covers.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly
so
right.
by background to our listeners, how I got interested in this whole subject and why I gravitated toward your book right away when I saw that excerpt in the Wall Street Journal, which was really nice. I've long, as the head of the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine, we debunk a lot of pseudoscience and nonsense, one of which is the claim that people are being abducted by aliens. And one of the signs that it's probably all in the head is that, the aliens are always humanoid-like. They're always these kind of bipedal primates with some gnarly stuff on their forehead and the big almond-shaped eyes, and there's always sex involved. And, it's like it's such a human story.
Yes.
And so a few years ago, I made a little joking, fun video about this, and I heard from, of all people, Richard Dawkins, who said, well, now, not so fast, Shermer. Yes, of course, these people are probably all having, sleep paralysis-type dreams, but, what will aliens actually be like? It's not inconceivable that they would be something like us in a general sense.
Right. Yeah.
That you have to have, your brains and sensory apparatus on one end, a waste disposal system at the other end, and some appendages to move around. And all of a sudden, it's not completely crazy that you'd have something like a primate.
No, that's right. There's a logical, set of sensors that you need to perceive the environment around you. As you say, you would be trying to detect electromagnetic radiation. You could imagine, for example, that aliens might detect infrared or UV like some organisms on the Earth. So there's certainly variations possible. And it's those variations, I think, in physics that lead to the huge diversity of life that you see on the Earth. Endless forms most beautiful, as Darwin put it. So even within the bounds of physics, there's endless detail. But the forms of life are really quite narrow. And I think that when you look from this book is all about looking at the smallest scale, the atomic level, right the way through to families of ants and birds. And I think, it's not a new view from me. This is something that's emerging amongst physicists and biologists as a growing recognition that you can describe life at every level of hierarchy using equations and using physics. And I think that's really a thrilling thing, that we can finally grapple with this apparently completely almost limitless biosphere that we see around us.
Yeah, this exchange I had with Richard, he referenced Simon Conway Morris and his book Life's Solution, which really heavily emphasized a convergent evolution. And he was something of the, I think, antithesis to Gould, Stephen Jay Gould's maybe overemphasis on contingency and chance. And, I think Gould had his own motives for overemphasizing that, but they kind of had this debate about the Burgess Shale, which you write about. Was it this completely open-ended, anything could happen, and we just happened by chance to go down this one pathway, or were there certain determining factors? And I think you strike that balance nicely.
I think it's undeniable. Part of this is a matter of taste. If you really like the details of life, the minutiae of life, the way in which a butterfly's wing can vary, then contingency and chance and the great variety of life on Earth could certainly be your focus. But for me, I think what's more stunningly beautiful is the commonality throughout life at all levels of its structure and the way in which physics corrals and channels life. So I would think the convergency of life, the similarities. Of course, physics isn't just about things converging on the same form. I think it's also interesting that physics can tell you about what's not in the biosphere, like why don't animals have wheels? So convergence is just one part of that link between biology and physics. And I think Gould's focus on contingency was certainly an important focus, because he did ask the question, how much chance is there in biology? But for me, his view that physics is just something in the background that's a bit of an irrelevance, and everything that's interesting in evolution is contingency, doesn't really strike at the core of what you have to try and understand to be able to make sense of the biosphere and to be able to link it with the fundamental laws of physics that ultimately must drive all things in the universe, including life.
Yeah. So let's take some really simple examples, like a fish or anything that lives in the water. You have to have a fusiform body, just sort of the streamlined, smooth thing, if you want to move.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that's a beautiful example, because if you don't want to move that fast, then fine, you can be like a sea urchin, you can be round and large. Exactly. So that, again, is another example of how there are many varieties of water living organisms and all their different manifestations. Again, endless forms, most beautiful. But if you want to escape prey and you want to be a predator and you want to get through a liquid like water fast, then that's exactly right. You've got to have a streamlined fusiform body. And if you look at a shark, that's a fish, and a dolphin, that's a mammal, and an ichthyosaur, which is an extinct reptile, they all have fundamentally the same sort of body shape. And you would predict that if you went to another planet and you found life forms having to move fast through liquid water, they would also look like dolphins, sharks, and ichthyosaurs. And this has nothing to do with contingency. It's just hydrodynamics. It's animals being formed by the laws of physics. And you can flip that as well into the air, of course. Things flying around are channeled by the laws of aerodynamics. You need a certain size of wing to get enough lift, as we all know when we fly in an aircraft. There's no escaping that physics. And contingency can change the feathers, it can change the details of a wing, but it cannot change the fundamental surface area and size of wing that's needed to lift a certain mass off a planet. Of course, if you live on a planet with different gravity, your wing is going to be a different size. Right. So therein lies an opportunity for other life forms on other planets to be slightly different, but they will still be ruthlessly channeled by the laws of physics.
But aerodynamicists talk about the angle of attack of a wing, and that whatever the air pressure is or the density of the air, the formula is going to still say you have to have a certain percentage of angle of attack if you want to achieve lift.
Yeah, that's right. And these laws, these equations, of course, they're not as fundamental as some physical laws, like the second law of thermodynamics, but they are universal equations in the sense that they describe what you need to do to lift a body off the surface of a planet in a given atmospheric density. And so given a certain set of conditions, like an atmosphere of a certain thickness or a certain gravity, there's no escaping how that wing has to be for an animal to be able to fly. And so for me, all those equations that channel life, I think, are much more interesting, because they're the things that bind us all together as a biosphere and make sense of these endless forms that otherwise just seem completely inexplicable and too profuse to really be able to grapple with.
Right. Yeah, in the 1970s, I got involved in bicycle racing. And then I got involved with the International Human-Powered Vehicle Association, which wanted to remove all the rules and just say, create the most aerodynamic bicycle you can with a shell around it. Yes. And then I met Paul McCready, who had just won the Kramer Prize for the crossing the English Channel in a human-powered airplane. And Paul was, in addition to being an aerodynamics engineer, he was a glider. And everybody who had tried to win the Kramer Prize for going across the English Channel under human power alone had failed, because they were making these designs based on human conceptions of flight. And he just looked at birds. And he took, I think it was J.B.S. Haldane's quip about, evolution is smarter than you. That evolution has had, 100 million years to design wings or whatever. Yes. So let's just see what evolution did, and then I'm going to copy that. So, and he came online at a time when composite materials were getting light enough that you could have the equivalent of bird bones that are hollow and super lightweight, and then the skin is lightweight, and just huge wings to distribute the mass that you have to carry. And I always thought that was a good lesson on following the rules of physics and evolution.
Absolutely. And it's amazing that, this sort of biomimetic technology of looking at what nature has done and try and learn lessons for technological design is so recent. I mean, obviously people have looked at bird wings to try and fathom out how to fly for a long time. But the idea of really bringing biologists and physicists together and looking at how organisms develop surfaces that don't get fouled in the sea, stopping barnacles from growing on your surfaces, which we need to do with ships. The idea of using nature to try and solve technological problems, I think, has only really got going in the last sort of couple of decades, seriously, in terms of parts of departments in universities. And it's amazing that you would have thought that we would have realized a long time ago, if you really want to develop technology, the first place you might want to go to is the biosphere, which, as you say, has had 3.5 billion years of experimentation. There's a fairly good resource there for looking at how you build structures or even build biochemistry.
Right. Yeah. So let's actually the first picture, actually the only picture in the book, is this little mole right there. Yeah. And even that, I never really thought about it. It has to be shaped a certain way with a digging apparatus at the front, simply because of the density of what it has to go through.
I was planning on, I didn't really think about images at all. I thought about having some, and in the end, I just thought it was nicer to describe these things. But then I was looking at images of mole rats to see whether there was one out there that would really exemplify this equation about P equals F over A, the fact you need to exert a certain pressure to burrow your way through the ground. And I saw that, and I thought it was a beautiful image. And so I thought I'd put it at the front of the book. I thought I could get away with it. I mean, not to be too grandiose, but Charles Darwin only had one image of his phylogenetic tree. So I thought I'll have one image, and mine will be a mole rat exemplifying physics in action in biology.
So if you want to go through dirt, you have to be kind of tubular shaped with a digging apparatus in the one end. Absolutely.
I mean, that's a very common shape. And yet again, of course, you can find exceptions. Horseshoe crabs burrow, and they're not very pointy, and even things like armadillos build quite large burrows, and they're not particularly pointy. So if you've got very strong claws or limbs, you don't have to be a pointy shape to burrow. But if you really want to build lots of long, thin tunnels underground and be able to do that quickly, it's a bit like our fast-moving fish. You need to be able to push that dirt aside with a certain force, and you need to be able to do it over a small area. Otherwise, you can't dig fast enough, you can't make an effective burrow. So you find that small burrowing rodents around the world have this sort of mole-like shape. Some of them have very tough front feet that allow them to push the soil apart. Some of them, as exemplified by the image in my book, have very large front teeth, and they use their teeth to to move the soil aside. So again, there's some variation, same physics, but you can either use your front feet or your teeth. So there's wonderful variety in all of this, but it still fundamentally is being channeled in the same way. And if you look at other things that burrow, like worms are fairly sort of pointy, long creatures. Obviously, they don't have legs. So snakes as well, invertebrates that burrow tend to converge in on this shape. And even fungi, microscopic organisms that move through soils around the roots of plants, have been shown to be able to exert huge pressures at the end of these hyphae, which are these thread-like parts of the fungi, and people have measured the pressures on those, and they can build up extraordinary pressure against soil grains to move them to one side and move through soil. So again, the same physics from the microscopic scale right up to a mole, and it channels a certain shape with certain allowances for variation, depending upon whether you're, in the case of the mole, using your front feet or the teeth, but you still see that same equation, P equals F over A, pressure equals force over area, channeling life. And I think I chose the mole just because it's a particularly beautiful example of one equation that I think nicely illustrates how physics shapes life. Obviously, in any given creature, there's lots of different equations depending upon the different types of food it might eat or different lifestyles. But moles have that particular characteristic pointy tubular shape that I think illustrates.
I think one of the things I hadn't thought about reading your book was the importance of scale on the role of law versus chance and contingency. At very small scales in physics, there's indeterminacy, but in biology, the smaller the scale, the more predictable it's going to be. So maybe talk to us a little bit about scaling up from atoms to molecules to, say, cells, and that if you're gonna find life on another planet, it's got to be cellular, most likely.
I think so. The cell in any environment has a tendency to dissipate and disperse molecules. Of course, you can get environments like the pore space in a rock where things can get very concentrated. So if you want to build a cell, or if you want to build a life form where you've got lots of molecules interacting and doing complex things, you could be inside a pore space in a rock where those are concentrated, but you're not going to go very far.
Right.
In fact, I give the example in the book of the garden pond, a hypothetical garden pond where lots of material has been blown into a pond and is collected, and suddenly a metabolism has emerged, and you could come up with some sort of hypothetical idea about how that might happen, but the garden pond isn't going very far. If you want to disperse organisms or life forms, whatever you mean by that, across a planet, one of the best ways to do that is to put it in a bag, and then that bag can move around and be exposed to different environments and be selected for through the process of evolution. So as soon as something became encapsulated, it inevitably would have been spread across the planet. And as I say in the book, it didn't want to do that. One mustn't sort of think that things tried to become encapsulated for some purpose of spreading around. It's just as soon as you had a metabolism inside a bag, immediately it was released from wherever it originated, whether that was a hydrothermal vent or a rock on a beach, whatever you believe. But as soon as it was released from that environment, it would have then been able to spread across the planet and been exposed to different environments and selected in different ways. And then evolution was fully underway. So I would expect that cellularity or some sort of compartmentalization would be a very common thing to find in any type of life form that evolved anywhere, particularly if it was to spread across a planetary surface with all of its different diluting environments.
So you're defining life as this kind of self-contained unit that also has some kind of self-replicating mechanism.
Yeah, well, we could get into the discussion about what defines life as well, which of course is a huge.
Well, give us your definition, your working definition for the book.
I used a working definition, and the working definition I used was to say that I'm interested in lumps of matter that replicate and evolve, and that's my working definition of life. My real view on life is it's just a human word, and we use it as a definition for a certain branch of matter that does some interesting things. And for us, those interesting things are reproducing and evolving. And once things start to evolve, they make, pterodactyls and kangaroos. So we're interested in that branch of matter, and we call that life. Now, some people might say, is a virus alive? It needs a cell to replicate. And my answer to that would be, it doesn't really matter. That's the whole point. It's a human definition.
Right.
And if you think that a piece of protein with a bit of genetic information in is life, then fine, include it within life. And if you don't, then that's fine. At the end of the day, life is just a part of organic chemistry that defines a group of replicating bundles of matter that happen to interest us, and we call that material life. And of course, because it's a definition, where you choose to draw the line is always going to be grey. There's always going to be interesting bits and pieces of molecular chemistry, like bits of DNA inside protein coats as viruses that are going to sit at the edges. And whether you want to call that life, it's really just a matter of definition. But I don't think it's an interesting thing to spend hours and hours on.
Right.
I quite understood why people spend centuries trying to define life.
Yeah.
So for the purpose of this book, I had to take a working definition. So I'm interested in how physics describes those lumps of matter that replicate and evolve that we could also just happen to call life. If that makes any sense. It's a rather long-winded response.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. You're probably familiar with Paul Davies' idea of the second Genesis. We should be looking for alien life here on Earth also. Yeah. There was some maybe early experiment 1 billion years ago or whatever. And but the question is, what would constitute it being truly different from our lineage going back? Probably some kind of different, not DNA, something, a replicating molecular system different from DNA. What could that possibly be? Something like an RNA or a spin-off from an RNA?
It could be. One of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that people have started to look at alternative nucleotides for genetic codes. And it seems that the 4 that are used in life on Earth are of a specific type, that they bind in a particular way to produce base pairs. But also they're of a particular chemical size and structure that allows for just the right amount of bonding, but also flexibility as well. And it's fascinating that people who have studied different nucleotides and made RNA molecules using different nucleotides have found that those used in life have a sort of optimum ability to form a code, but not be too inflexible. So you do wonder whether, if life originated again, whether it would in fact come up with a totally different set of molecules, or whether in fact it would channel in to using the same nucleotides. So one could argue that the nucleotides used by biology on Earth, again, are not just contingent random events, but have actually been selected for. So then you might ask, well, what about the machinery itself? Do we really have to go from DNA to RNA to protein? And could we look for something in terms of Paul Davies's idea? If you found another origin of life on Earth that it was a completely independent origin, would it stumble across DNA turning into RNA and protein, or maybe something else that's different? And I don't think we know the answer to that. I would be surprised, like we were talking about earlier, the variation in moles and winged animals and things in the ocean. I'd be very surprised if a second origin would show exactly the same molecular structure as we know in our own life. Even if it stumbled across the same nucleotides and physics caused it to produce the same type of code, I suspect you would find variations within the molecular architecture of how that code is read, how it's turned into protein.
So if we found cellular life on Mars, still alive, and it had the same DNA structure with the same 4 base pairs, you would assume that was human, it was an earthly-based life form that got ejected from a meteor impact, say, and the bits went into orbit and ended up on Mars, which is sometimes projected as what might have happened for us. But not that it was independently evolved and used the same DNA structure and 4 base pairs.
I would be more cautious after I've written that book than I used to be. Having read all the literature again about changing the genetic code and looking at alternative base pairs and why life on Earth uses the ones it did, it could be that another origin of life would end up homing in on the same types of nucleotides, nuclear bases that are used in terrestrial life. But as I say, I think you would expect variation in the biochemistry even if it used the same nuclear bases. So I think that something that had the same DNA code and that turned into RNA and protein as Earth life would probably be a fairly good indication that had been transferred from Earth or vice versa, and was related to life on Earth. Yeah.
Right. So scaling up again from atoms to molecules, so you've got some kind of self-replicating machinery. You've got a self-contained semi-permeable membrane that holds the bag of stuff. And then the next big transition in life is multicellular. So is there a logic based in physics to why cells would start to, like Lynn Margulis's, what was her theory? Not angiogen.
Endosymbiosis.
Yeah.
That's right.
That there's kind of a logic to cells getting together because they're more likely to survive in a team than by themselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, you can look at it from a couple of points of view. One is that if something can get bigger, it just will do. And if it becomes larger, it can prey on smaller items. This is what Stephen Jay Gould used to talk about, moving from the left wall. Right. If you're a small cell, you can't get any smaller because there's a minimum cell size. So you naturally tend to move to the right and become bigger. So there's a physical logic there in the sense that if that space is open to become bigger and produce an organism that can then prey on smaller items and gather up more energy efficiently, then the first mutation that makes something bigger is likely to be successful. So you could argue that it would just happen at some point. One of the challenges in doing that, in building up something larger, is having enough energy to be able to do that. And it's certainly true that if you burn organic material, organic molecules in oxygen, you can produce about 10 times as much energy as types of energy acquisition, anaerobic methods of energy acquisition that don't use oxygen. And it's interesting, the rise of animals does seem to be contemporaneous with the rise in oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. So building big things that can swim around and have claws and do all these other great things may require the rise of oxygen to produce this powerful oxidant that allows you to burn lots of energy and create those bigger sizes. So certainly there's a tendency, I think, to become bigger just because you can, but you also need the energy to be able to do that. But again, that's linked to physics, right? This is thermodynamics, how much energy you can get out of burning organic material in oxygen. So that's a physical constraint on life becoming larger, is simple energy acquisition. So we're back to thermodynamics again,
right.
Channeling. But now not just channeling the size of organisms, but when those major evolutionary transitions occur in the history of the planet. So it's working on this macro evolutionary scale as well.
Yeah, a favorite paper of mine is written by John Tooby and Lita Cosmides, two evolutionary psychologists here at UC Santa Barbara. I live in Santa Barbara here. And it was called The Second Law of Thermodynamics is the First Law of Psychology. And that natural selection is the only known mechanism to drive organisms up the gradient, the energy gradient, and that all of life is just trying to capture energy. It's energy capture.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I think that's right, and this is in some sense why there's a physical inevitability about it. Once you start building molecular machinery that extracts energy, it produces material that will replicate, and once it starts replicating, then inevitably there are errors, and you produce variation. So the process of evolution just follows from the creation of a replicating bit of matter that's extracting energy from the environment. I think there's nothing remarkable about this. One of the things I've learned in being a biologist, moving into a physics department, thinking about biology, is actually how unremarkable and mundane the process of evolution is, and in fact the whole of biology. And the more one tries to understand it, the more complex it is, the emergent properties of life, but at the same time, the more simple it seems in some way, the more inevitable it seems that this process would happen.
Well, it's this principle of uniformitarianism. Wherever we find life on a planet, it's going to be around a star, so it's going to get most of its energy the same way we do. So the physics says it's going to have to be capturing energy pretty much the same way because they're all subject to entropy and all the problems.
Absolutely. And one of the fascinating things I think in microbiology over the last 20 years is that people can look at the periodic table and predict what types of reduction oxidation reactions will make energy. So if you take one element and you mix it with something else, can you make energy from that? And you can predict that microbes would be able to use uranium, for example, with organic material. And indeed, you can find microbes that get their energy by reducing uranium, not like in a nuclear power station, but by shifting the electrons around. And people have made predictions about microbes using particular elements to get energy. And sure enough, if you go into the environment, you find them using these elements. And that's why you have microbes eating hydrogen, for example, with carbon dioxide, microbes that make methane. Then you find microbes using iron and different oxidation states of sulfur. It is just rummaging around in the periodic table looking for electrons as the source of energy. That's where the energy comes from in biology. At least that's the easiest type of energy for life to get, is electrons out of molecules. So all life is doing is rummaging around looking for free electrons to drive its processes. That's why you eat sandwiches. Your sandwiches are just a nice, convenient way of eating electrons. And
that's really basing it down in physics, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. But that's biology. That's biology.
Now, in origins of life research, is always discussions about, is there some other basis than carbon that we can look for extraterrestrial life, say, or imagine an origins of life scenario that wasn't based on carbon? And you have an example from one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek, the original series of the Horta, the rock eating thing that also ate all the crew members wearing red jerseys, because they're the ones that always got destroyed and killed.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
But so then Dr. McCoy saves the Horta by putting, I think it was a rub of silicon on there, because it's not carbon, it's silicon based. Could life be silicon based?
Well, I think one should always keep an open mind again. I mean, I wouldn't want to say it's not possible, but I think the evidence that we have tends to suggest it's not possible. I think one of the reasons is that silicon, it's a larger atom than carbon. It has a nasty habit when it gets hold of oxygen of forming these very regular structures that we know as silicates, or to you and me, rocks. Right. And I like to remind my astrobiology students that we've had 4.5 billion years of silicon chemistry and experiments of silicon chemistry going on the Earth. It's not like silicon-based matter is some strange stuff out there in the universe that we're still trying to find in the Starship Enterprise. Silicon chemistry has been going on the Earth, and you find an amazingly wonderful variety of silicates. But we haven't yet found an intelligent rock. And the reason for that is that silicon tends to form these very regular structures when in the presence of oxygen. So it forms a variety that is similar to carbon. It's just that the chemistry of that atom leaves it with a tendency to form rocks rather than sort of uniformly repeating molecular structures, rather than the sort of variety of structures you can form with a carbon atom. And I think it's very telling that when biology gets hold of life, and that's another thing we should remember, is biology does use silicon. So there are phytoliths, which are structural units found in plants, and they provide some sort of structural support in plants. And sponges in the deep sea have spicules, which are like these pointy structures that form in the skeleton of a sponge and provide it with shape and form. So what's interesting is that when life gets hold of silicon, it tends to do rock-like things with it. It uses it for structural support. And so again, we should remember that life isn't static. It's constantly rummaging through the periodic table in the process of evolution, testing out different elements for different uses. But on this planet, when life has got hold of silicon, it tends to do rock-like things with it. It hasn't yet built a cell in the sense of the Horta that's silicon-based, where all the molecules are made of silicon. Now, can we rule out that on some planet where there's some location where perhaps there's less oxygen or there's some different chemical conditions, there has come into existence some sort of self-replicating silicon-based life form? I don't think at the current time we can completely rule that out, because chemists have done some quite interesting things in the lab with silicon. If you do deny it oxygen or provide particular chemical and temperature conditions, you can make some interesting chained silicon compounds. And the whole area of organosilicon chemistry, that's not my expertise, but I've read a few papers about it, and it seems to be getting going and finding some quite interesting things about complex silicon compounds that we never knew about beforehand. So we can't rule out, I think, interesting silicon-based molecules. And of course, we shouldn't rule out the idea of organosilicon life forms. Maybe there's something to be said for a hybrid system between silicon and carbon. But I think there's, again, a logic and a physical logic behind the fact that life on our planet from the beginning has homed in on carbon to build most of its versatile molecules, and then has rummaged through the rest of the periodic table using things where it can to build the structure of life.
Right.
And I suspect that would be the case elsewhere.
Yeah. So scaling up from cells and multi-cells, you start to encounter larger structures in organisms, the development of organs themselves, and large organisms that have to push through air, water, or propel themselves around on the land or whatever. So you get this huge variety of life forms, and yet even those are restricted. So let's say, for example, you use this, like if you double the size of the Earth or double the gravitational pull of the Earth, what would that do to legs and arms and how we can move around?
Yeah, there's this well-known relationship that if you double the size of an organism, then you cube the volume, but you only square the surface area.
Right.
So if you have a planet with higher gravity, you've got to support that mass on a larger cross section of bones. So, for example, on a 10G planet, 10 times the gravity on the Earth, you've got 10 times the weight, and that means you're going to have wider bones to support that mass on that planet, that weight pulling down. So you would imagine that for large organisms, at least, you would see the anatomical imprint of the gravity on a particular planet. So you probably would see slightly different creatures on that planet. And of course, like we were saying earlier, it would affect your ability to fly as well. Is the atmosphere dense enough for you to be able to fly with the same size wing against a higher gravity? So all these things will interact, and you will see that in larger creatures reflected in the way they're designed. But like we were saying earlier, for small things like ants and ladybugs, where molecular forces dominate and not gravity, you would expect those things to be very similar to things on the Earth. They're just not seeing gravity at all. They work at too small scales. So on another planet, again, small creatures, we can say, as a matter of physical principle, that gravity would not be a dominant force in those small creatures' lives. It would be molecular forces. But for larger things, we would expect to see, as I say, that imprint of that gravity in their anatomy. But that's not going to change the fact that the wing still has to fly. You still have to have a fusiform body to get through the water. And in fact, in the water, of course, gravity is not very relevant to even large organisms because they're buoyant. So we can imagine that on any other planet, physics would again shape life. And we can take a fairly good guess, I think, as to how it would shape that life based on what we know of life on Earth.
So let's talk about the ladybug, because it is such a great example. It's in that area. It's small. It's not molecular size, but it's not dog size either. It's kind of in that transition area. The way it gets its oxygen, the way it flies, and so on is rather unique to that size organism.
That's right. So at that size, if you imagine yourself in a ball of water, for example, the surface tension in a ball of water that forms a raindrop, for instance, if you imagine a sort of rather large raindrop outside your house, it's almost the size of a ladybug. So when you're down at the size of a ladybug and you're inside a water droplet, you're really imprisoned by the surface tension of that drop of water around you. And that's just a nice illustration of how molecular forces can dominate the life of a ladybug. If you want to get water off you when you're a ladybug, it's pretty difficult if you're trapped in a ball of water. Whereas for us, of course, we just use a towel. So this is an example. You walk out of a shower and the water just drains off. So gravity dominates in our world. But for a ladybug, you've got to be pretty careful because the gravity is not going to pull that water off you.
Right.
It's going to enclose itself around you. So that's just one example. And there are many other examples of how a ladybug can use molecular forces to get about its life. So, for example, if you're climbing up a wall and you're a ladybug, all you have to do is put a thin layer of liquid underneath your foot, and that very thin layer of liquid will create an enormous friction that will stop you from sliding down the wall, but it will also create a force, a surface tension force that will stick you to the surface. You can climb up a wall and underneath a leaf and upside down, and those molecular forces will hold you fast against gravity. If you try and do that and put some water under your feet and walk up the side of your wall vertically, you're obviously going to be sorely disappointed quite quickly. So the physics of a ladybug, how it lives its life, how it walks around, how it flies, is absolutely shaped by physics. And again, we see convergent evolution in many types of insects and small creatures that use these layers of water to walk around. And that's all just physics again, not contingency. It's physics driving things to the same conclusion. I had a group of students who were actually the inspiration for that chapter in the book. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to find out how many equations can describe a ladybug? And that in itself was motivated by listening to Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, who once, I saw him stand up in a lecture and say once, I'm really glad I'm an astrophysicist because a star is much more easy to understand than an insect. And I thought, well, why don't we have a look at that? So I told my students, go away for 3 months as part of your project and list all the equations that describe a star, nuclear fusion in the star, and everything that allows you to understand how a star works. And then write me a list of all the equations that describes how a ladybug works. And all the equations I would need to understand to be able to explain a ladybug. Anyway, the result was fairly predictable. The star took about 2 sides of paper, and there's some nuclear fusion equations and some description of nuclear synthesis in a star. But the ladybug went on for 40 pages. We had equations for flight, we had equations for the legs, we had equations for breathing, for oxygen diffusion, and on it went. And yet, at the end of the day, they were still just equations, just a lot of them. But a ladybug is just an exquisite bundling of physical equations in a small organic form that's been honed by evolution to have all these different characteristics that are manifested in the organic form, but are fundamentally just equations, the equations of life, which is why I named that book in that way.
Right.
It's just physics in organic form.
Maybe for an American audience that is steeped in intelligent design theory and creationism, there's a sense in listening to all this, to some people anyway, that there's a design to it. Like it's, why are organisms doing what they're doing? Why are they capturing energy? Why are they moving away toward complexity and so on? Even if it's not a religious motive, it almost feels like, well, I referenced in that Scientific American column I sent you Bob Wright's book Non-Zero. Like Bob's not religious, but he kind of hints that there's teleology to life, that there's a certain directionality to it, maybe built into the laws of nature itself. Not just moving away from the left wall simplicity, because if you get far enough away from it, then there shouldn't be any directionality. But it kind of feels like, multicellular organisms to colonies, language, intelligence, and if it wasn't us, it'd be Neanderthals having this conversation. And if it wasn't Neanderthals, you and I would be Homo erectus having this conversation. Yes. Inevitably, this would kind of, end up in this. And I think that maybe goes too far for my intuitions, and Gould of course pushed the contingency part, but where do you kind of stand on that directionality toward physics and evolution?
Yes, I'm afraid I'm going to be disappointing to those people who do see some design and direction. I do believe that we are just lumps of replicating matter on a planet evolving, and I think the idea of this life finds a way, this directionality, is a form of almost optical illusion. First of all, one has to remember, of course, that you can talk about directionality, but I think the metaphor of the left wall is a very good one. Things will become more complex, but you must remember, of course, that simple things are still around. We still live on a planet dominated by microbes. So this complexity is just being added on to a planet where most of the biomass on the planet is still single-celled. And so we build this complexity. If you have lumps of matter with a code in that are replicating, the laws of physics tell you cannot have 100% efficient replication of that material. There's always going to be errors. And so as soon as you have errors, you have variety. And some of those things are going to survive, and some of them will not. So evolution follows simply from a lack of 100% efficiency of replication and a lack of fidelity in replication. And because of that variety, if you produce enough of these lumps of matter and distribute them across a planet, a lot of them are just going to die because they end up in the wrong environment. But some of them will find the right environment and continue replicating, and then they will necessarily continue to replicate. So you end up with this illusion that life is somehow finding a way through, whereas in fact what you're simply observing is a very large number of lumps of matter replicating with errors on the surface of a planet. And those things that survive go on. And the directionality, the increase in complexity, is just because it can. If the energy is there, as soon as you get two cells stuck together that can eat things better, then it will be successful in the environment and it will replicate. And as long as it's not eliminated, it's now there.
Yeah.
So it will go on an experiment. There's nothing mystical or mysterious about this. Once something comes into existence with a code in, it will continue to replicate. And I think this is a conceptual thing. One really has to get one's head around this idea of just lumps of matter replicating. But I think we find that very difficult as human beings. One, because we really want to believe that there's something more in all this. It's very difficult to believe that you're just part of the carbon cycle.
Right.
I think my own view, this is going to get me in enormous trouble, but my own view is that religion is because of an inability to be, or a lack of willingness to be part of the carbon cycle. And I think that's really all there is to it. And the idea of this preordained directionality is an illusion created by the sheer enormity of the evolutionary experiment.
The illusion of design. Yeah, the word is loaded. I mean, in a way, functional adaptations like wings and eyes, you can say they're designed to see and they're designed to fly, and that's true if the designer's natural selection from the bottom up.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's that use of the word design that one has to be careful of.
Right.
Like all of these discussions, a lot of it is about language. In the sense they're designed by natural selection. Natural selection is selected for things that work. If they don't work, you don't go on to reproduce. That's the end of your line in the evolutionary experiment. So natural selection, and again, even that is loaded because it sounds like something special. All we're talking about is the environment killing off things.
Right.
Because they don't work very well before they reach reproductive.
I always thought it was peculiar, but maybe this is my 20th century American perspective, that Darwin opens The Origin of Species with this analog of the pigeon breeders. You know, and of course they're consciously designing and selecting, and nature's not like that at all. There's nobody out there doing this.
It is extraordinary. I think what he was trying to do, he recognized that this notion of things being selected in a natural environment was very difficult for the Victorian mind to grasp. And one thing that was very fashionable in Victorian times was breeding dogs and pigeons, and everyone understood that. That was a craze at the time.
Right.
So he knew that selection to make different dogs and pigeons was something everyone could understand. And I think he homed in on that just because it was a good way to introduce this idea that, hey, we already do this selection, therefore nature can do it. But I completely agree with you, because it risks flipping it the other way around, which is, okay, so humans are doing this selection artificially. That must imply that there's an artificer in the natural environment doing the same thing. But I don't know whether he consciously thought about that. I'd be surprised if he didn't. He was a fairly bright person, but maybe he just decided that was a risk worth taking for the price of getting the idea across at that time, which of course was very radical. So even to get the idea of natural selection across to people whose minds were very much focused on creation was a big challenge.
Yeah. Well, it is counterintuitive, and there's nothing in our evolved psychology to grasp those lengths of time. Dawkins talks about middle world. We evolved in this middle world of, middling sized things you can see that move, between slow and fast on our time scale. And, we're used to thinking of things in weeks, months, or years, decades at most. The idea of, the climate's going to change in the next 1,000 years. It was cold yesterday. What do you mean global warming? Or, I've never seen a dog evolve into a chicken, or, whatever creation has come up with these crazy ideas. But it's true. There's nothing to hook it in our brain. It's almost like quantum physics. There's nothing, or string theory. Every show you've ever seen on string theory has violins. It's like, they're looking for something to put it in here to say, this is what it's like.
Absolutely. It's the time, but also it's the biomass. There's estimates of 10 to the 29, 10 to the 30 microbes on the Earth. The sheer amount of organic material doing this experimenting on the planet is also vast. So if you take that vast quantity of the number of living things, and we just don't know how many living things there are. We have estimates for the number of microbes. The number of replicating things is not known. You take that and you project that across 3.5 billion years. And the numbers are really unfathomable to the human mind. If you really were being cynical, you might say it took actually quite a long time to come up with an intelligent ape. Why did it take 3.5 billion years? Actually seems quite unimpressive.
Right.
So you can turn this around as well and say that, there's been more than plenty enough time and biomass to produce what we observe on the Earth. There's no need for mysticism or I think a creator to understand that.
Hey, as a sidebar, because I haven't followed this in a while, but I remember for a while there was this meme going around that the biomass accounted for by microbial bacteria and so on is more than like all the trees and cows and humans and big scale organisms. Is that still believed to be true?
It varies. I think now people think most of the biomass is actually in plants. So the total amount of microbial biomass has been revised downwards, but it's still probably something on the order of 30-40%, and that will change as we improve our understanding. But it's a remarkable amount, and it reminds us that we do still live on a microbial world. Mm-hmm. And of course, the microbes dominate everything underground. That's another thing to be aware of. Going back to your middle world observation, of course, even in biology, we see things the same size as us, and we forget that underground, underneath our feet, is about 30% or around that of all the biomass of life on Earth, and it's living underground. So we live on a planet where most of life is deep beneath the surface rather than on the surface.
Well, let's move out toward extraterrestrial questions. We now know that there's a couple 100 billion stars in our galaxy alone, and it looks like virtually all of them have planetary systems. And if only maybe one or two were Earth or super Earth in the habitable zone, you're still going to end up with planets that should be able to evolve life on the order of a couple 100 billion to maybe 1 trillion. And given what we've just talked about, the kind of algorithms that grind through the natural laws of physics and biology away from the left wall and so forth, you see where I'm going with this. Where is everybody?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, there are many aspects of this. Let me take two of them. First of all, we don't know enough about the origin of life to know how probable that first step is between chemistry turning into a cell. So let me just say, let's just hypothesize, for example, there's one step in that has a 1 in a trillion chance. If that was the case, then it doesn't matter how many billion Earth-like planets you have, the origin of life is still rare. Right. So when you hear people say, well, given that we found all these Earth-like planets in our local neighborhood, and if we scale that up to the Milky Way, we come up with outrageous numbers like 5 billion Earth-like planets in the Milky Way. Therefore, there must be life elsewhere. That statistical argument does not work if there happens to be one step in the origin of life that's so unlikely that those numbers don't buy you any more planets. So we don't know that. I must say that the fact that we found things like amino acids and lipids in meteorites does suggest that the building blocks of biology can be formed quite easily. So I think science is moving towards this idea that what's required to build life has a sort of chemical inevitability, in which case, if you follow that argument through, you would expect to find life on other planets. But we still don't know that. So we can't use the statistical argument to say there must be aliens out there, therefore where are they? One explanation for the lack of aliens could be that there is something unusual in the origin of life. My own view is, and again, this is pure speculation, it's not even really science because we just don't know. Right. But I would imagine that even if there are intelligences, the distances to travel from one star to another are generally so large, it's extremely difficult to do that. If you do believe, and again, maybe physics at some point will prove us wrong, but the current knowledge of physics, we cannot go faster than the speed of light. Right. We have no good physics that definitively tells us that we can go faster. And that must mean that for most civilizations, getting to other planets and stars takes hundreds, thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands of years, even if they're going at a tenth the speed of light. And I could imagine that unless you're a very lucky civilization in a star cluster, and there happens to be another civilization that's emerged a couple of light years away, and eventually you could actually develop the technology to go there within a century or more, you could imagine that there are civilizations popping in and out across the galaxy,
and missing each other.
Exactly, and never really communicating. And that's a sort of depressing thought. I sometimes give lectures about this, and I say to people this: if I was to say to you, I would really like to come back and see what society's like in 300 years' time, but unfortunately I'm going to be dead, you're not going to come up to me and say, stop being so negative. You should be more positive about your future.
Right.
That's not a negative statement. It's a statement of reality.
Yeah.
And it could be that our civilization has yet to confront the idea that we will die in this solar system and never make contact with another civilization, and that the Star Trek future is just unrealistic. And to deny that future is not negativism.
Right.
It's
Realism.
a reflection of the reality of moving through the galaxy. And maybe we're just too young as a civilization to confront that reality yet. We're still living in the Star Trek optimism of our adolescence.
Right.
We've yet to realize that we're
you know,
not going to go.
I like to make the point on the other end of the scale that, you know, you can have an evolved world like ours and get all the way to Neanderthals. And as you know, our own species hit a bottleneck like 100,000 years ago, in which there was maybe a few hundred to a few thousand individuals that could have easily been wiped out. And I don't think Neanderthals or Homo erectus or whoever else was on its way to becoming us. You know, they could just be, you know, living in caves or even primitive hunter-gatherer type groups and never develop telescopes and radio and space travel and so on. And no one would know we were here unless they came here, unless there was some way to detect in the atmosphere methane or whatever and determine that there's life. But there would be no inter-civilizational communication because they can't communicate.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is another thing we don't know is how inevitable intelligence is, and it comes back to the physics thing. Is that inevitable? Well, like all evolutionary developments, like our energy development, you need a selection pressure to push it in that direction. And unlike the need to get energy that every organism has, not every organism has to become intelligent.
Right.
This is not like many other adaptations that life really does need to progress. Things can reproduce quite successfully without intelligence. So. And the dinosaurs managed for 150 million years in a reptilian state of dormancy, not a dinosaur space program in sight. So, and yet, as I say, they were around for 150 million years. So maybe something like 50 times longer than our own species. So the question is, is intelligence inevitable? But as you say, even if you do have it, what are the chances of that intelligence existing at a time that's contemporaneous with another intelligence and the technology to make communication? And even if they are contemporaneous with the technology to make communication, if they're limited by the speed of light, is that likely to happen anywhere in the universe other than the rare places where you've got two civilizations and two stars that happen to be very close to each other? So there are many things that might stand in the way of civilizations not communicating. So for me, this Fermi Paradox, if there are ancient civilizations, why aren't they here, may not be a fundamentally difficult problem to solve. There are many reasons, I think, why one could end up being lonely.
I mean, you could have a civilization like ours that goes for 10,000 years and still miss everybody on the time and distance scales we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And that would be the simplest explanation. If you want to take Occam's razor, the simplest explanation for an observation, for me, the simplest observation is they're just too far away and they're not at the same technological level. And that's...
You know, it was interesting. My doctoral dissertation was on Alfred Russel Wallace, and in 1903 he wrote a book in which he concluded that we're probably alone, just based on, he wasn't religious, but just based on arguments from the number of steps to go from chemistry to us.
This is Man's Place in the Universe.
Yeah, Man's Place in the Universe.
Yeah, that's an outstanding book.
And the conditions to get from chemistry to us are even much more complex than he ever imagined. So again, it wouldn't surprise me that we're alone, or at least very rare. And as you know, Simon Conway Morris, Life Solution, I thought he was leading toward this idea that there's going to be evolved life forms everywhere, and he ends up concluding we're alone.
Yep.
So
So what's interesting about this, I mean, again, sort of talking about the more philosophical point, is that we may be extremely mundane in the sense we're lumps of matter just simply replicating and evolving in accordance with the laws of physics, but we might turn out to be exceptional after all.
Right.
So our mundane physical basis may still be something remarkable in the universe. So simply conforming to the laws of physics and having no creator and just being a product of physical processes does not necessarily mean that life on Earth isn't a remarkable product of the material universe and how it behaves.
Well, whether we're alone or rare or whatever, we're about to become a spacefaring. Well, we're already a spacefaring species, but multiplanetary species, and colonizing Mars and stuff. So you've given some thought to this. Given what you've been talking about, the laws of nature and so on, there are also laws of human nature. Just people are certain ways, and we're tribal, we're selfish. We're also cooperative and altruistic, and the whole civilization experiment for centuries now here has been to fine-tune and tweak the variables or the incentives to get people to be nicer and be less violent and so on. And this is the kind of thing that I wrote about in the Moral Arc, and Steven Pinker's written about. Yeah. And so on, that we have been figuring out what to do better and better, but boy, we have a long ways to go. As we see in the daily news, there's always problems and conflicts. So how would you, if you had Elon Musk here to say, okay, if you have 10 people on Mars, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, you have the scaling problem of human conflict that comes about just from numbers. Yeah.
One of the big errors in organizing human societies, and I think you touched on it there, is to try and turn people into angels, to try and tweak it. There's this idea that society is this big machine. If we know enough, we can turn the knobs enough, right, and it'll all be perfect. And one of the moments of genius, I thought, of the founding fathers. I mean, they did a lot of amazing things like the Bill of Rights and writing the Declaration of Independence. And these were remarkable documents. But for me, the part that was genius in all of that was that they recognized that human beings can never be made perfect. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And that came from Montesquieu's idea that power must be made to counteract power. You can't make people perfect. You must actually take a slightly cynical view and assume that they're very imperfect, and then create the checks and balances to hold those slightly more negative aspects of humans in check. Right. So when we go into space, I got interested in this a while ago, in that space is, I think, an inherently tyrannical or a tyranny-prone environment. You are living in an environment where the oxygen that you breathe is being produced by a machine. Now, on the Earth, the government can take away your food, and they can take away your water, but they can't take away your air. So you can run off into a forest and you can plan revolution, and you can get your friends together and you can try and overthrow a government. If there's a possibility of taking away people's air that they require on a second-to-second timescale, you really have the potential for absolute tyranny in a way that we do not see on the Earth. This could happen on the Moon and Mars, where you're inside a habitat. The oxygen is now being controlled by a corporation. You complain that you're being tyrannically treated and you want more freedom. And all the organizers of that settlement have to do is turn around to you and say, oh, you're absolutely right. We're terrible. We're really tyrannical. Let me open the airlock door for you and you can escape. So freedom can actually become very cynical in these environments. Right. The question is, how do you build a successful society in an environment that's inherently tyranny-prone? I don't want to believe that democracy and freedom is something that's very special to the Earth, and that all people that venture out into space are destined to be living in tyrannical environments. And so a few years ago, I convened a number of meetings, and we published some books on freedom beyond the Earth. And the first meeting we had, we thought about what is freedom beyond the Earth, what threatens freedom, such as the oxygen problem. Right. There are other problems as well. And then the second meeting was, given those problems, how do you build your ideal government in space to maximize freedom? And then the last meeting we had, the third one, was, once you've built your government, what happens if you decide you don't like it? Can you have a revolution in space? Because if you smash up the infrastructure, you cause depressurization, particularly in a small environment. Right. Threaten everyone. So can you even have a revolution in space? It was an enormously interesting thing to do. We had about 40 people. Some of them were planetary scientists, some of them social scientists, political philosophers, science fiction writers as well, because they've thought about that quite a lot. Heinlein, the moon is a harsh mistress. So these things have been thought about by science fiction writers. But we thought about this from a more academic point of view. So Elon Musk's interest in how do you build a society on Mars, I think it's a big question. And I think it's not a trivial question as to how you build a society that doesn't degenerate, even with the best intentions. into a tyranny in space.
Well, would you have like common ownership of the air or the machine that creates the air and water and so on?
I would tend to go in completely the opposite direction. I would fragment as much as possible. I would try and create plurality in the means of production and create competition, have many people able to produce oxygen. I would try and make oxygen producing machines that can be tended by individual people. So, for example, on Mars, you can crack the CO2 atmosphere and make oxygen. So if you can get oxygen directly from CO2 and not from water. So if you've got to dig for water, then someone has to dig the water and melt it and then electrolyze it. But if you can get it out of the CO2 atmosphere by chemical reactions, then you've got the possibility of people owning their own oxygen producing machines.
Sure.
So what you're trying to do is decentralize all the time.
Yeah.
And after months of discussing this, I think you come to the same conclusions you come to on the Earth. Centrally planned governments generally end up as not very good experiments.
Right.
You want to maximize
tyrannical.
Yeah,
What about corporations that, let's say, get a market head start on everybody else, and everybody's freely trading, but the big guy can sell his oxygen at half the price, and so before you know it, he's captured the market, and then it turns tyrannical.
Well, cynically you can say, what can you do? I mean, these things happen on the Earth. What you have to do is hope through education that people will believe in a greater good, that writing some sort of document with a Bill of Rights, I mean, we've seen it happen. It happened in the US. You can get people to agree that it's good to try and build government for the people and not build tyrannies. And we have successfully done it on the Earth. It's hard work, as we can see around the Earth today. Mm-hmm. It's hard work to get people to believe in freedom and to fight for it. And I think in space, it's going to be even more hard work. But so in some sense, you have to believe that people will want to create free societies. I think there's a lot to be said technologically. If you can build spaceships that allow people to leave and move around, that will enhance the ability of people to leave settlements that they perceive to be tyrannical. If spaceships are difficult to build and very few people build them, then it's easy to see people getting stuck in settlements over which in which corporations or governments have complete control over people. So you've got to give people freedom of movement, freedom of information. It's really no different from the Earth. It's just a more expanded and more vigorous version of what we need to do on the Earth to maintain freedom. But I think those problems are magnified in space. So it's going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about it. Building a free society in space is not, I think, going to be an easy thing to do.
What documents would you recommend Elon or read, or the first Mars colonists take with them to help design their new society?
The U.S. Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. Well, they may not need the Declaration of Independence yet.
They're already independent.
Yeah, maybe later when they've built a settlement. But nevertheless, that document has wording that's extremely relevant for how you build a government that is built, for the people and is not tyrannical. So it's not just about independence, that document. It's also about the ideals of free governance. So I think it's a good document. And the founding fathers, I don't know why. I think it was just because they all gathered in a room and thought about it from scratch. That document has a sort of clarity and crispness that is very different from every other country where these documents have evolved. Oh, we're back to evolution again. It's funny to say that actually I prefer a document that hasn't evolved and that was radically developed. But in that case, I think it has a freshness about it rather than other documents from other countries that maybe have the mark of history in them and are perhaps not so clear in the thoughts about freedom. So if I was going to go to Mars, I think taking example constitutions from the Earth and rebuilding them around the extraterrestrial environment. So having, for example, freedom of access to oxygen, that's not something you would put in a Bill of Rights on the Earth just because it's not necessary. It's quite difficult to take away people's atmosphere. But that is something that might want to be enshrined in a Bill of Rights on Mars. You might want to say that everyone has the freedom to have access to have oxygen, the freedom to bear their oxygen machine instead of arms, for example.
What about the Universal Bill of Rights and maybe the Humanist Manifesto and some of these other documents that have just how people should interact with each other, treat one another, And the whole idea of rights, I mean, we just made that up to a certain extent,
Yeah.
although it's based on what each of us wants and respects that other people also probably want it because of human nature. So therefore, we should, maybe draft a set of, again, like the Bill of Rights, here's the 10 or 50 things that we all respect and will protect for each of us.
Yes, my tendency is to not constrain too much how people should behave towards one another. One would hope that anyone in that environment would understand that the outside environment is inherently lethal, and so a culture of some sort of independence and interdependency and respect for others would emerge naturally. I think it's better to try and protect certain vital resources like oxygen that people need, and to minimize the extent to which people can control those sorts of resources. For example, things like access to water and food, in some sense, you do need to enshrine them. In some sense, you don't, because if you don't provide food and water for people in the extraterrestrial environment, they're not going to live for very long anyway in such extreme conditions. So by default, people have access to those, or else your settlement's going to fail. I think one shouldn't be too prescribed, and in fact, the diffuseness of the way in which people think and the opportunity to have a free-thinking environment is in fact the best insurance against the extremity of the extraterrestrial environment, the flexibility for people to discuss a society as it develops. If you constrain it, it adapts less quickly. If you allow free thought, people can come up with inventive new ideas.
Right.
What you simply have to do is stop people from controlling food, water, and oxygen to a tyrannical level, and control the settlements within an organization. And again, I would go back to this idea of trying to fragment it, try to create almost different districts in a settlement. You almost want to start off by creating modularity in your settlement. And one of the things I suggested in one of those books was that you could incorporate liberty into architecture. You could modularize a settlement so that there's lots of oxygen production machines and lots of food production machines. So the failure of any one of them does not threaten the whole settlement, and therefore give the incentive for one person to control that unit as a way of controlling the settlement.
I think it's good to remember how difficult this is going to be. I mean, as hard as it was for the first people who came to America from Europe, of course there are already people here, and many of them failed, and the experiments failed and failed, and they had all the air and water and food on the hoof, and free
and
land. I mean,
fields.
just
Absolutely,
and still it was hard.
Water. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, there were various, and as you say, there were the indigenous populations, which was one of their major challenges that they had. So that's one thing that obviously wouldn't be there. There were other things like storms, for instance. I mean, actually, you don't have terrible storms on Mars. You have dust storms, but not storms wipe away your settlement. So there are things about the extraterrestrial environment that are less extreme than the Earth.
Or more stable, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, more stable. No sort of torrential downpours that wash away crops. So there are things that are better. But you're absolutely right on those fundamental, the air, the oxygen, and the food.
Yeah. Let's see, there was something else I was going to... so I do wonder to what extent we would, since it's people, would end up with these kind of factions like we see now, where so you have people like you and I who like individual freedom and autonomy and smaller units, and then you have the, say, conservatives who say, well, but wait a minute, there's certain traditions we know that work, and we should emphasize those as well, something like religion and rule of law and, the kind of a larger federal government. So you have this constant tension between, say, the federal government, states' rights, individuals versus the collective, and so on. And maybe we're just kind of genetically predisposed to have some people by temperament gravitate toward more individual autonomy and freedom. They just like to be left alone. They don't need a lot of big social structures to feel comfortable in the environment. Those are liberals. And conservatives tend to be less risk averse. They like a predictable hierarchical social structure. By temperament, it makes them feel better to know that tomorrow is going to be just like today, and I like it that way, and I don't want those aliens coming across the border and having to learn a new language, and I just want to go to church every Sunday, and I like a predictable world. And we know that there are lots of people on both of those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as you rightly say, we know that that's the way humans are, and that's the way they've been for thousands of years. And rather than trying to sort of alter that and try and make people one form or another, the best forms of society are societies where the social structure is sufficiently flexible that that society can move towards more individualism or more collectivism, depending upon the challenge it faces. And everyone can be part of that discussion. And that's what we call democracy, right? It allows some people to do their own thing and other people to suggest ways of doing more collective things. The disasters happen when you try and artificially construct societies that are wholly controlled from the center, or where there's no organization at all and you create an anarchic society. The best forms of society, I think, have always been ones that are flexible and modify themselves over time as fashions and ideas change. And that's why I think Western democracies are reasonably successful at keeping people happy to the maximum extent we can try and do that. And I think in space, there's going to be nothing different there. Obviously, you've got an environment that requires a little bit more collectivism to get water out and to make your oxygen. So you're forced to be a little bit more interdependent to survive in such an extreme environment. But nothing will change the idea that the best form of society, I think, in that extreme, will be one where there isn't top-down control from a central government that's simply telling everyone what to do, but where everyone's ideas can be heard.
Right.
And those people that can make the best contribution by being a bit more individualistic can do that in their own way. So what you're trying to do is build something like a constitution and a Bill of Rights that's sufficiently flexible that society isn't destroyed by the extremity of the extreme conditions, but where there is an ability to get together and organize things against this inherently lethal environment.
So lots of checks and balances.
Lots of checks and balances. And, you know, how you do that is something they have to decide. This is where it becomes a bit hand-wavy, because you can say, I'll just come up with a Bill of Rights and a constitution, it'll all be fine. But that's actually the answer.
Right.
The people living in these extreme environments are just going to have to, like the founding fathers, sit round and, with an understanding of their new environment, try and come up with the best form of constitution they can.
Right.
And everyone else living in that environment is going to have to believe in the idea of not trying to usurp it and constantly debate and discuss it in a healthy way that creates a free society. Easier said than done, but that's the...
and then I do like the idea of expanding the moral arc or advancing on the expanding the moral sphere, advancing on the moral arc. That, for example, we abolish slavery, and you know, it never even enters my mind to like enslave somebody. If I go to Mars, let's find somebody to enslave. I mean, that would never. Yet, you know, 500 years ago, that would be the first thing somebody would think of. Okay, who can we enslave to do our free labor? So maybe your idea of education and just culture, it gets people to think a certain way, and there's just no going back.
Yeah, and that's again is the democratic flexibility in a society. No one has the right answers, and things change over time as we become more enlightened. And this is why you don't want centrally controlled societies, because that lack of flexibility does not allow for these changing perceptions, this enlightenment that occurs over time, and that enlightenment again, it comes from rogue elements in society, right? You have new ideas that seem crazy at the time, but eventually become mainstream as people think about them and realize actually that's not a bad idea. But for a rogue element to become not a bad idea and a majority idea requires that ability to listen to people, to minority elements in a society, which going back again is why, you know, democracies have generally been relatively successful at allowing this evolutionary progress of society rather than, you know, continuous bloody revolution and centrally planned disaster.
Yeah.
So, and I think you have to again do that in space, but yet again, just to reiterate, easier said than done. But it's the sort of ideal, and we have done it on the Earth, and I think we can do it in space as well. And all one can really say is good luck to the people
who do it. Yeah. Yeah, it won't be you and I, but it'll be our kids that go.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, you know, this little quick Twitter exchange I had with Elon, you know, what would you do? Oh, no representative democracy. I like direct democracy, so everybody has a say.
Yeah.
And laws should be short. Long laws are very suspect, you know, and I can see where he's going with that. You know, when there's long, convoluted laws, there's lots of ways for people to manipulate the system and cheat.
Yes.
and representative democracies. You buy off the representatives with lobby groups. Of course, these are all kinds of problems. But as I forget, it was Madison or Jefferson who talked about the tyranny of the majority. With a direct democracy, you get 51% say, "Well, you're out." Well, wait a minute.
And it's capricious, right? I mean, this is how ancient Athens partly fell apart. It was one of the failings of their democracy, as it was direct democracy. And they were constantly at the mercy of demagogues who would stand up in front of the whole of the assembled crowd and get them jeered along, going in one direction. But as you say, representative democracies can be bought out. So nothing's ever perfect. I would say the other thing is it's quite difficult to do. I mean, Athens did pretty well with a direct democracy with thousands of people. So you can make quite big direct democracies. But I would expect in space, as on Earth, you get to a point where a representative democracy would be a good idea, because people want to get on and do their jobs, and the technicalities of talking about specific laws and things might be better left with elected representatives.
In your conference you had, did you address the already on the books space laws about no country can own the moon or Mars?
No, we sort of ignored all that.
I mean, this was written back in the 60s. I don't know if anybody pays any attention to that.
I think space agencies do, but I think it's a real problem now. Private companies are going into space, and people are obviously thinking about this more. I'm not really too involved in that, but I certainly see conferences and discussions going on where people are revisiting the UN Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Treaty. Who owns the moon if a private company lands there and starts mining there, and how big an area can they claim? So these are real issues, and they're more issues of finance and ownership than necessarily political philosophy. But ultimately, they'll impinge on political philosophy, just because if a company claims a large area of the moon and sets up a settlement, those people who work there are going to find themselves under the control of a settlement. So I think it's really interesting. I guess the question is, can we really direct it at all? Or can these things only be decided by people who get there and set up a settlement? I mean, you can sit here with the best intentions and come up with laws about how the moon should be managed. But what are you going to do if a corporation lands there and set up a mine? You're going to send out the Interplanetary Space Force? Or how do you enforce laws?
I mean, I can see a company setting up, say, in a crater and saying, okay, to the edge of the crater, that's our territory that we're going to mine, and then some other company sets up in the other crater and they meet on the ridge and go, well, no, this is we have this, no, that's we have that. Okay, who resolves that conflict?
What do? It may be that interplanetary laws will only be resolved when those situations finally come about, and there may be laws developed here on the Earth by the UN, but ultimately they may be ignored. Companies may go and just set up settlements on the moon, and then only really think about legalities when there are practical conflicts and it actually becomes important to them.
So where can we read about this? Are there proceedings from your conference that we could read online?
Yeah, there are 3 books that were published by Springer with all our essays in. Unfortunately, they're not very cheap. They're quite expensive.
I noticed that. It was like $130 for the book. See, you're a monopoly.
I know. We've already
gouging.
done precisely what we don't want to do in space. I need to find out a place. I've put a lot of those chapters on ResearchGate, but we need to put them somewhere where people can access them for free. Because at the moment, it's the books. You can download the chapters. If you go onto the Springer website, if people have interest in particular chapters, you can buy the individual chapters. I think there's something like $20 a chapter, so you don't have to buy the whole book. So that's a sort of cheaper way to find the things you're interested in. But they are all out there.
And in I don't read that much science fiction, but who has thought a lot about this and written a lot about it?
Well, Heinlein thought the most about it. He was a libertarian. He thought a lot about tyranny on the moon. Stephen Baxter has thought about it. He was one of the people who actually came along to our workshops. He wrote a really nice chapter on liberty in science fiction. As a science fiction writer himself, he's read an enormous amount, so he had sort of instant access in his mind to all the novels where people had talked about various types of freedom, and so he summarized that in a very nice chapter that was useful for the rest of us. Of course, a lot of the science fiction writing is done in a fictional narrative. It hasn't really been drilled into in a sort of purposeful academic. So we were really keen on just giving it a bit more serious thought about how it would work. But the science fiction writers had a lot to bring to the table of, thoughts about the more extreme versions of.
Well, maybe this is your next trade book.
It's a good point. Yeah,
Dear Elon, here's what you should do.
It would be nice to summarize it in a more popular form, actually, and discuss it.
It's a hugely interesting question. I mean, it's always been interesting just from a sci-fi perspective, but now it's like, well, you mean we're going to actually do this?
Yes, absolutely. It's becoming more and more relevant.
Yeah.
I did take 4 of my essays and I put them together in another book that is a lot cheaper called Extraterrestrial Liberty, an inquiry into the nature and causes of tyrannical government beyond the Earth. I sort of enjoy it's sort of 18th century title that I really enjoy. I love the way they titled books in the 18th century were great. But that was 4 essays I'd written on extraterrestrial liberty, and that is cheap. But again, it's not sort of colorful popular writing. It's more sort of academic essays.
Right.
But it's a fascinating area.
Charles, we've been going almost 90 minutes, and so we'll sign off here. And you're really fascinating. This is just all great stuff. I mean, it's really just a nice example of integrating all the different sciences. Here we start talking with physics and evolutionary biology, and now we're in space talking about democracy. So and that is the way it has to go. I think we have to integrate our sciences so that we all have shared ideas and develop new ideas from there. I mean, one of the most exciting things about colonizing spaces, maybe somebody will come up with a completely different idea of governance that we've just never thought of.
Absolutely, could be. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we don't know what we don't know. And
that's what's so fun about all this, right? It's working at these interfaces between fields and boundaries that's where all the ferment happens.
Right.
And you just don't know. I'll probably look back on these sorts of discussions we've just had in 200 years' time and think, how could they have never thought of this type of governance for a space settlement?
Exactly. Yeah.
Who knows?
It's the best argument for cryonics I've seen. Not that I want to live forever. I just want to come back in like 300 or 400 years and go, oh, yes, that's what they did. Oh, and look what we believed. Oh my God, I can't believe I believed that.
I would love to see what's happened in 500 years and whether things have turned out well.
Exactly. Like if somebody from Newton's time was here now, it'd like, oh no. Really? Oh, I see. That explains this. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for your time. The book just came out yesterday. It's a beautiful book, The Equations of Life, How Physics Shapes Evolution, and I hope the book does well. It's a beautiful read. It's a great book, and good luck with your future projects.
No, thanks very much. It's been great fun to talk to you.
Yeah. All right.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, bye.